Okay, I think we're here. So for our next speaker, I'm excited to introduce Professor William Irvine. Professor Irvine has taught philosophy at Wright State University since 1983 and has authored 8 books that have been translated in over 20 languages, including The Stoic Challenge, A Philosopher's Guide to Becoming Tougher, Calmer, and More Resilient. He specializes in Stoicism, which has extensive groundwork in resilience, and I hope you guys are as excited for his presentation as I am.
Oh, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I assume you're out there. I can't see you. I'm still not used to this particular format. And I want to thank Sid for that introduction and thank all of you for showing up to hear me. I'm going to start today by telling you a little bit about my dreams. A year ago, I changed my sleep routine, and as a result, I've been getting more sleep per night than I have in a long time. And during that sleep, my dream life has switched into high gear. I have lots of dreams, often 2 or even 3 of them per night. They can be quite long, and as a rule, they involve problem solving. And this means that they aren't particularly restful. It turns out, in other words, that my actual dream life is not at all like the life of my dreams. My dreams come off like amateur movies, the screenwriter for which is schizophrenic. They follow dream logic, which is to say that they don't make any sense at all. The setting will change without explanation. Key actors in the dream will leave the stage, never to be seen again. And the interesting thing is that during my dreams, this chaotic logic is accepted and even expected by my dream self. Recently, I had a dream in which I wanted to fish in a river. The problem was that at the very spot I wanted to fish from, a bunch of albino alligators had assembled, making it both difficult and dangerous for me to fish there. I was trying to get them to move by poking at them with a stick when it occurred to me that being awake would be much less stressful than having this dream. So I woke up. Who comes up with this crazy stuff? I asked myself, only to realize that since it was my dream, I was the one that came up with it, or rather some deep component of my mind that came up with it. Despite getting sufficient sleep at night, I routinely take daytime naps as well. And I know that sounds luxurious, but it's especially true after I've exercised. So I'm nearly 70 years old, and the rule seems to be that I need a minute of nap for each minute that I exercise. Back when I was 60, back in what I refer to as the good old days, this wasn't the case. And the naps are interesting because when I close my eyes to take a nap, I routinely experience hypnagogia. And I don't know if you've heard about this, but I'll be lying there and I'll know my eyes are closed, but I start seeing things the way I would if my eyes were open and I were actually seeing them. But what I'm seeing is not the room in which I'm napping. It's instead something happening outside that room. I might, for example, see a group of cyclists zooming by me on a road. I know that if I open my eyes, they would vanish, but I don't open them because I enjoy the illusion. I've now become a connoisseur of hypnagogic illusions. After a few moments of this enjoyment, though, my conscious mind checks out and I'm sound asleep. When I awaken, I might wonder about what happened and ponder this phenomenon. Who decided that it would be cyclists that I saw? Why not circus clowns instead? Who decided how many of them there would be and what color their jerseys would be? Again, the answer is that some mysterious mental component of my unconscious mind was responsible. Now, I think that what I've just told you is by no means an unusual experience. I don't know if you're prone to hypnagogia. I seem to have developed a talent for that. But the rest, you know what I'm talking about. And what they demonstrate is that when our conscious mind is out of action, as is the case when we're asleep or falling asleep, our unconscious mind takes over and presents us with a strange dream or with a hypnagogic image of cyclists. The thing to realize, though, is that even when our conscious mind is fully awake, fully present, its unconscious components routinely manifest themselves. It's just that we're oblivious to the evidence they present. One wonderful way to gain a better understanding of the role these unconscious components play in our conscious thinking is to do a Zazen meditation. It's actually a particular kind of form that a Zazen meditation can take. And in this meditation, your goal is to empty your mind of all thought. In the early 2000s, in conjunction with research I was doing for my book on desire, why we want what we want, I did this meditation. It's the first meditation I had ever attempted. And let me describe that experience. I found a quiet place, sat on a chair, and set a timer for 5 minutes. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and let my mind go blank. It was only a few seconds, though, when I found myself thinking about how my mind had gone blank, meaning that I was thinking, meaning that my mind wasn't blank. Okay, time for a do-over. I took a deep breath and again relaxed my mind. Within perhaps 10 seconds, though, I found myself thinking about what I was going to be having for dinner. Oops. I dismissed the thought, took another deep breath, and commenced take 3 of this particular meditation. I got off to a pretty good start, but then found myself thinking, this time about something snarky that a colleague had said to me the day before. Oh well. I struggled on until at last my timer sounded. The 5 minutes was up, and I felt a sense of profound relief. I'd always known that thinking was hard, but who would have thought that not thinking was even harder? If you've never meditated, I strongly encourage you to give it a try. All it takes is 5 minutes of your time at 0 cost and with 0 physical effort. And let me tell you, the insights you gain during those minutes can have a profound impact on the way you subsequently live your life. This, at any rate, was my experience. What this meditation revealed to me is that I'm not the source of many of my thoughts, which is to say that my conscious mind is not the source of many of the thoughts that appear there. My conscious mind is capable of summoning up thoughts, like when I'm trying to remember the capital of Minnesota. But in many more cases, thoughts simply drift into it without being summoned and without even asking for permission to appear. All your life, you've been experiencing the semi-random flow of thoughts through your conscious mind. As a result, this seems perfectly normal to you. This is a normal state of affairs, and it's one that therefore needs no explanation. It's just how things are, you tell yourself. It turns out, however, that there is a reason why things are this way. More precisely, there's a reason why your mind has unconscious components with the ability to push thoughts into your conscious mind. And there's a reason why your conscious mind typically responds by taking ownership of those thoughts. You say, well, the thought is in my mind, so it must be my thought. Okay? Allow me to explain. Like the rest of your body, your brain is the result of billions of years of evolution. If you traced your family tree back 1 billion years, you would find direct ancestors. Your direct ancestors would be there among the living things that existed. Otherwise, you wouldn't exist. None of those direct ancestors would have had arms and legs, though, nor would any of them have had brains, meaning that they went through their entire lives without having a single thought. Don't take it personally, but your ancestors were truly mindless. Move forward to 500 million years ago, though, and you'll find ancestors who had very primitive brains. They had reptilian brains because they were reptiles, and those brains were purely reflexive, capable of, for instance, fight or flight responses, but nothing beyond that. Move forward to about 150 million years ago, And you'll find ancestors whose brains had developed an emotional component, and they were capable of experiencing a variety of emotions. Finally, move forward to the last few million years, and you'll find ancestors whose brains at last had a rational component. At last, they had the ability to reason. The important thing to keep in mind when considering this evolutionary history is that the emotional component of the brain did not replace the reptilian component. It was added to it. It nestled in side by side with it. Likewise, the rational component of the brain did not replace the emotional component. It was added to it once again. As a result, you are a being with what has been called a triune brain. It has three parts. It has a reptilian component, an emotional component, and a rational component. If you've ever nearly drowned, you have had direct access to the reptilian component of your brain. This contact came in the form of a strong impulse to thrash around in a state of panic instead of continuing to swim in an orderly fashion toward the surface. When I was learning how to swim, my mother said, if you get underwater, the one command was, don't panic. And I'm glad she gave that advice, because otherwise I probably wouldn't be here now to talk to you. Now, to get in direct contact with the emotional component of your mind, what you need to do is fall in love. And love is just such an interesting phenomenon. You don't decide you're going to fall in love. You don't get up one morning and look on your to-do list, and one of the items is to fall in love. You discover that you have, and it's this emotional component of your brain that lets you know. The three components of your brain interact with each other, but because they have different game plans, they can come into conflict. And this conflict is one of the things we're going to be talking about today. But before I go any further, a bit of a disclaimer is in order. This theory of the triune brain that I just proposed, or just described to you, was developed by neuroscientist Paul MacLean back in the 1960s, and it has its critics. But I'm going to use it here today because in the remarks I'm making, it's a useful way to get a quick handle on what's going on, and it gives us a readily accessible format in which to think about the mental conflicts that we discover within ourselves. It's easy to assume that finally, on its evolutionary arrival, the rational component of the brain would take charge of things, that it would play the role of mental CEO. And it did, sort of. But it had subordinates to deal with in the form of the brain's reptilian and mammalian components. Your conscious mind is presumably the domain, the stage of the rational component of your brain. Although it's responsible for many of the thoughts that appear there, many more are inserted there by the mammalian and reptilian components. In theory, your conscious mind could ignore them or could exclude them altogether, in theory, if it were really the CEO. But in practice, the rational component of your mind routinely accedes to the demands of the other two components, and even bends over backwards to help them get whatever it is they want. It plays the role of lackey to the other two components. To understand how such a thing could happen, we need to realize that the reasoning ability that is the defining feature of the rational component of your brain is useless in its dealings with the reptilian and mammalian components. And that's because they're incapable of reasoning. You can't reason with them because they can't reason. We also need to realize that the mammalian and reptilian components don't fight fair. When we're awake, they plague our conscious mind with intrusive thoughts. And as a result, the rational component of our mind might be so distracted by all these thoughts that it can't think straight. When bedtime finally comes, the intrusive thoughts continue, and they make it impossible for the rational component to fall asleep and thereby get the rest it needs so they can wake up the next day and think clearly about what's going on. And I'm guessing that you've experienced what I was just talking about. And you know the story. You turn off your bedroom light, lay your head on the pillow. It's been a long, hard day. And you think, at last I can sleep. But then you realize that you're thinking about something that someone said to you. Or maybe you're thinking about the partner who cheated on you last year. You find yourself feeling angry. And as a result, you toss and turn rather than drifting off to sleep. After an hour of this, you finally calm down. And just as you are about to drift off, the angry thought again appears. And you end up getting very little sleep that night. And as a result, you wake up mentally exhausted. The rational component of your brain is ready to capitulate. It's going to give, so for instance, if the reptilian component wants revenge, then so be it. It's just tired of the fight. The reptilian component has won. Now, that your rational mind would do such a thing is bad enough, but in many cases, instead of merely capitulating, the rational component becomes a collaborator. It not only allows the reptilian component to have its way, but comes up with plausible sounding reasons why it should have its way. Psychologists have a term for this phenomenon. They call it rationalization. Curiously, it's often the case that the more rational a person is, the better he is at rationalizing the desires of the subrational components of his mind. Shouldn't be that way, but it is. Besides having intrusive thoughts to get what they want, the reptilian and mammalian components of your brain might instead engage in chemical warfare of a sort. And in defense of this claim, let me take a little side trip to compare your cell phone to your brain. Your cell phone is a computer in which the thinking is done by 8 billion transistors. These transistors are as identical as technology can make them. Each is directly connected to a few other transistors. Okay, if I were a circuit designer, I could give you the precise number that a transistor is connected to, but alas, I'm a mere philosopher, so I can't do it. The connections between transistors are permanent. The transistors and their connections comprise what is known as an integrated circuit, which in turn is enclosed in plastic to prevent the transistors from being affected by changes in their immediate environment. And finally, the integrated circuits in your cell phone are themselves enclosed in the phone's liquid-resistant case. Because its transistors are so well protected, a late model cell phone will continue to function when submerged in a pitcher of beer. Or at least this is what a Google search would have us believe. But my advice is don't try this experiment at home, at least not with a new phone. And I should add that the cell phones haven't always been this resistant to liquids. Story in the early 2000s, my son somehow managed to drop his cell phone into an oversized cup of lemonade. Despite subsequent resuscitation efforts on our part, the encounter with lemonade turned out to be digitally fatal for the phone. Okay, that's your phone. Now, your human brain, by way of contrast, has 10 times as many neurons as a cell phone has transistors. And whereas the transistors in the cell phone are as alike as technology can make them, no two of your neurons are alike. Furthermore, whereas each transistor in your cell phone is connected, as I've said, to a few other transistors, each neuron in your brain is connected to perhaps thousands or even more than 10,000 other neurons. And whereas the connections between transistors are permanent, they're fixed, neural connections routinely change with the passage of time, with new connections being formed and old connections disappearing. The ability to form new connections, by the way, makes your brain a very resilient organ. Indeed, your brain can compensate for the loss of half of its neurons as long as the loss takes place early in life. Whenever you have a thought, it's because electrochemical activity is taking place in your neurons. Whenever you come to believe something, it's because your neuronal connections have changed. If a brain surgeon with supernatural abilities were able to undo those changed connections while leaving the rest of your brain untouched, you would stop believing whatever it is you came to believe. That surgeon could likewise remove or alter your memories, since they're stored in the form of neuronal connections. And the new memories would be as real to you as the memory of having eaten breakfast that morning, except it would be a fictitious memory, a created memory. Let me pause here to comment on how amazing it is that a tangle of neurons can, by means of electrical activity, give rise to consciousness. How could something so physical give rise to something so mental? I'm not going to attempt to answer the question here for the simple reason that I don't know the answer. As of Tuesday, my suspicion was that the question itself is somehow bogus and therefore unanswerable, the way the question, how high is up, is bogus and unanswerable. But like I say, this is just a suspicion. As we've seen, engineers go to great lengths to prevent the transistors in cell phones from being affected by changes to their immediate environment. Your neurons, by way of contrast, are immersed in a solution, the chemical composition of which can change. If you've ever imbibed alcohol, you will have noticed the effect that this can have on your ability to engage in rational thinking. It turns out that the reptilian and mammalian components can infuse hormones into your cerebrospinal fluid. And this is what I mean by chemical warfare. And when they do this, it can affect your ability to reason. Suppose, for example, you give birth to a baby, or are present when your mate gives birth to a baby. Your neurons will soon be awash in hormones that will trigger some astonishingly powerful positive emotions in you. You can experience instant love. More precisely, you can experience the all caps version of that emotion, love. Experiencing it can in turn have a substantial impact on your trajectory through life. Meanwhile, the rational component of your mind, which 9 months before had argued that it's a terrible time to have a baby, will sit back and say nothing. It's been silenced. Okay, enough for this side trip. Let's turn our attention back to the question of who or what is in charge of your mind. You have, as we have seen, you have been endowed by the process of evolution with different components, and that these mental components, and that these components can be at odds with each other. The process of evolution has also provided your brain with an incentive system. It's not a written set of rules. It's instead wired right into it. But this is, of course, just a matter of speaking. Your brain doesn't have wires. It has neurons. So more correctly, this incentive system has been neuroned into you. Because of this wiring, some things feel good and some things feel bad. Having sex, for example, feels good, while getting burned feels bad. Similarly, some things, like ripe fruit, taste and smell good, while other things, like rotting flesh, taste and smell bad. For many people, the fact that some things feel good and other things feel bad is simply a fact of life. To an evolutionary psychologist, though, there's a very good reason why things feel good and bad. Imagine two early hominids. The first was wired so that ripe fruit tasted and smelled good, and rotting flesh tasted and smelled bad, and was also wired so that having sex felt good and getting burned felt bad. Now imagine the second hominid being wired so that rotting flesh tasted and smelled good and ripe fruit tasted and smelled bad, and was wired so that having sex felt bad, was intensely painful, and that getting burned felt good. This second hominid would soon have died from disease from eating all of this rotting meat, and combined with the infections that would result from self-inflicted burn injuries. The first hominid would be vastly more likely to survive and reproduce than the second would. And those of us who are around today have inherited this wiring. That's why things feel good and feel bad, because our ancestors who felt that way about them, who were wired to feel that way about them, were more likely to survive and reproduce. Now, their wiring would have been quite useful on the savannas of Africa 200,000 years ago. The thing to realize, though, is that those of us who have inherited that wiring live in a radically different environment. For our ancestors back then, getting eaten by an animal was a real danger. For us, it simply isn't. For them, getting enough food to survive was a challenge. For most of us, though, food is not only readily available, but overly abundant. The fatty food that for them would have been a luxury is for us commonplace. And so we find ourselves in the midst of an obesity epidemic. Consider again the Zazen Meditation. One thing that becomes apparent when you do it is that there's a pattern to the thoughts that appear in your mind. Many of them are future directed, like the question about what you're going to have for dinner. Others are directed toward the past, like the memory of the snarky remark your colleague made. More generally, if you monitor your thoughts, the thoughts that drift into your mind, you'll find that precious few of them are directed toward this very moment. And again, there's an evolutionary reason for this. Imagine an early human, let's call him Dave, who found it easy to stay in the moment, but difficult to think about the future or the past. He might, as a result, have been perfectly happy, sitting on a rock, staring out at the savannas of Africa, thinking, isn't this just wonderful? Now, that level of satisfaction, but on the savannas of Africa, it would have come at a price. It would simultaneously increase Dave's chance of getting eaten and decrease his chance of finding his next meal. Dave would therefore have been likely to perish before creating offspring, and he would have taken his easy-to-please genes with him. So, besides being wired with an incentive system, we're wired with a propensity to think about the past so we can learn from it, and to think about the future so we can plan for it. We aren't wired to be in the moment. For similar evolutionary reasons, we're wired to care very much about our social status. An early human who was part of a group was much more likely to survive than a solitary individual would have been. It was a pretty challenging environment, after all. Furthermore, his status within whatever group he was in had a big impact on whether and what he ate, and if he was a male, on how extensively he mated. Although we are in a dramatically different situation than those ancestors were, we still care very much about our social status. We're wired to do so. So as a result, we might go into debt to acquire to acquire possessions that will impress the people around us, or better still, make them envious. And we might care very much about how many followers and friends we can acquire on the internet. It was only about half a century ago that scientists came up with the evolutionary explanations of human behavior that I've been sharing with you. Long before that, though, there were individuals who were aware not only of the unruly nature of our thoughts, but of the way this unruliness can affect our lives. They recognized our tendency, when a thought floats into our mind, to take ownership of it, and therefore to act upon it. They also realized that many of these thoughts involve desires, and they realized that usually on satisfying a desire, we didn't live happily forever. To the contrary, it wouldn't be long before we found ourselves experiencing a new desire. and the process would begin again. As a result, we would end up spending the one life we have to live in a state of dissatisfaction. You know, that's the human plight of living in misery. And there were people who realized that it doesn't have to be that way. And so there were wise people, thinkers in the past who diagnosed the human predicament without knowing all of this science. Not only did that, but they came up with ways to remedy the human predicament. The Zen Buddhists did this, right? So they said, just because you find a thought in your head or a desire, you shouldn't take ownership of it. It just got there. And what you should instead do is dismiss it because it's not going to be good for you. And they also recommended doing meditation of various kinds in order to improve your ability to dismiss undesirable thoughts. Now, the ancient Stoics, who are my area of specialization, also grappled with the human predicament. But their advice on how to rectify our situation was rather different than that offered by the Buddhists. And I want to explain the Stoics' primary insight in terms of what I call the gap theory of happiness. We're dissatisfied when we are. We're dissatisfied because there's a gap between what we have and what we want. The obvious way to respond to this situation is by working hard to get the things we want and thereby close the gap, which is precisely what most people do. But it's a fatally flawed strategy, since as soon as the gap is closed, because we've satisfied that desire, a new desire will drift into our mind, thereby creating a new gap. And we're no better off than we were before. The Stoic, there was another Stoic insight, the Stoic insight with respect to this. They came up with a much less obvious but much more effective way to close the gap between what we have and what we want. Instead of working hard to get the thing we want, we should learn to want the things we already have, because then the gap closes. We don't want something that we don't already have. We want what we already have. And this will allow us to embrace the life we find ourselves living and attempt to draw from it as much delight and even joy as we can. Our happiness, to the extent possible, will have been restored. Now, before I go much further, I think a clarification of who the Stoics were and what they weren't is in order. The Stoics were started as a school of philosophy founded by Zeno of Citium in 300 BCE. The Greeks started it. It spread to the Romans, and the most famous Roman Stoics were Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and then the fourth one's kind of an outlier, but very important, Musonius Rufus, who is actually a teacher of Epictetus. Key thing to keep in mind about the Stoics is they were not stoical. You know, people have this idea of what is a stoical person. Well, it's a person who's like anti-emotion. It's a person who just stands there and grimly takes whatever life can throw at him. The Stoics weren't anti-emotion. They were anti-negative emotions. Those are the ones that feel bad to experience. And among them are things like anger, envy, anxiety, and regret. They were opposed to those, and any sensible person will be. But the Stoics saw nothing wrong with positive emotions, such as feelings of delight, a sense of awe, and even the experience of joy. In fact, they went out of their way to have those positive emotions and had strategies for doing that. At this point, you might be thinking that it would be wonderful to follow the Stoic advice to embrace the life you find yourself living, but you might at the same time be puzzled by how exactly you can accomplish that. What if you have a kind of a miserable life? Shouldn't you be miserable? How can you embrace that life? Well, fortunately for you, the Stoics came up with a number of psychological strategies you can use to increase the number of positive emotions you experience in the life you find yourself living, and dramatically decrease the number of negative emotions you experience. And this in turn will make it much easier for you to embrace the life you're living despite its imperfections. Now, I describe these strategies in detail in my book, Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy. So I'm going to touch on one of them here and encourage you to dig into the rest. They're easy to learn. They aren't really complicated, and you can give them a trial run and see if they make a difference. So one of the things you can do is what the Stoics call negative visualization. So this is a psychological strategy. You do this by looking at your life and imagining how things could be worse. And you might say, well, they're as bad as they can be, but they aren't. You're just not using your imagination. Think of the things you could lose that you value. This could include your job, your health, your partner, your child, right? Now, why do that? It sounds like a recipe for misery or even depression. Well, you don't dwell on those things. You allow yourself to have a flickering thought about them. You imagine what your life would be like if you lost those things. Just a flickering thought. And then it's back to life as usual. And what you'll find, probably, is that for a time you will enjoy those things. You will savor their presence in your life in a way you hadn't before. And that'll last for a while, and then you'll fall back into the old practice of taking them for granted. But the beautiful thing about negative visualization is it's like the prescription cream where the instructions say use as needed. You can do this on an ongoing basis, and it really does keep you focused on the life you're living and keep you appreciating that life, because you know what? It could be vastly worse, and you take so much for granted, and that's part of being a human. There are other psychological strategies, like I've said, that you can practice, and you would practice if you became a practicing Stoic. But given the theme of this conference, I'm going to focus my attention on Stoic views concerning resilience. The Stoics realize that life is full of setbacks, and they also realize that setbacks are capable of causing us to experience the negative emotions that will disrupt our tranquility, including, like I said, feelings of anger, feelings of anxiety. And finally, they realize that when we're set back, what hurts us most is not the setback itself, but our response to the setback, our emotional response to the setback. That's what hurts us. So to explain this, I like to use what I call the broken pipe analogy. So suppose in your home, in the second floor bathroom, water pipe bursts. The water pipe itself isn't your problem. It's part of the problem. But to get it fixed will require, $200 in a half hour of plumber's time. That'll fix that pipe. Your real problem is all the water that it emits until it's fixed, because it's going to flood the floor. It could collapse the ceiling of the room below, and you could imagine all of that ceiling bits and pieces and all that water all over your furniture. That's the problem. It's not the broken pipe. It's the water that's released. And that's the case when we're set back, when something happens in life that we hadn't planned for and that goes against our interests. That's one factor. But usually what hurts us the most is our response. Because what do? We get angry. We get upset. We get depressed. And the Stoics had ways of dealing with that. And they said, you have little control over whether or not you're set back. You can plan ahead and minimize the number of setbacks you experience. You know what? If you're going on a long trip through the desert, you get your car filled with gas before you go. But even if you take precautions, setbacks are going to occur. And they realized you can't control that, but you can control how you frame the setback. You can think about the psychological context in which to put that setback. And one way you can do that is you can take any setback you experience as a test administered by imaginary Stoic gods. Okay, I know this sounds strange, but if you want a deeper explanation, you need to take a look at the one I provided in my most recent book called The Stoic Challenge. So the idea is you imagine that there are these Stoic gods who are behind these setbacks, and they don't do it to punish you. They do it to strengthen you. They're like good coaches. You know, a good coach doesn't pamper the athletes. A good coach builds them up. A good coach challenges them and encourages them to do their best. And that's one way you can take life setbacks. You can take it as a challenge. You can rise to that challenge. And you can feel proud of having risen to that challenge. Okay? And how do you know you've successfully met a challenge? Two things. First is you figure a workaround. It may not be perfect, but it's a workaround for the setback. And second thing is you keep your calm and cool as you do it. Now, that's what you do in order to deal with a setback when one actually happens. The Stoics had a second plan, though, and that was that you should prepare yourself for life setbacks. You should engage in a kind of Stoic training. And what does that mean? That means you should spend time doing things you don't want to do. For instance, you should do things that are where setbacks are likely to happen. Go on a camping trip. Go on a long hike. There are going to be setbacks that you hadn't expected. They're going to pop up. Why do that? That seems crazy. Well, because you get a practice at dealing with setbacks without getting upset. You get practice at coming up with clever workarounds to setbacks. That increases your self-confidence. Another kind of thing you're going to do as your Stoic training is you're going to do things that are hard, which means things in which you're likely to fail. How come? Because you will expand your comfort zone by doing that. You'll find that you can fail, learn from your failure, and get back with the life as usual. And you're going to be a better person for having done that. You know, it's a curious thing, but most truly successful people have failed a lot. And a lot of people who have never done anything have never failed for the simple reason that they fear failure. One great way to overcome a fear of failure is to do lots of it in low-grade ways, you know, not colossal failures, but failures because you'll learn. You can bounce back. And that's what Stoics advised. Do things that are hard to do. Do things where there's a danger of failure. Learn to bounce back. Don't break. Learn to bounce back. Okay. Now, you're doubtless aware of your body's biological immune system. If it's impaired, or even worse, if you lack such a system, you're going to be in a bad situation because germs are going to take you over. You're going to get sick. You're going to die. So what's the advice for someone with respect to their immune system? Ideally, your immune system will be developed. It'll be one of the things you work on and try to develop it. And how do you develop it? You expose it to germs, okay? And we're all now getting vaccinated. Yeah, hope we are. I've had my two. And once you're vaccinated, your immune system perks up. It says, oh, here's something I got to be ready for. So if you're parents and you have a kid, there's one side of you that's going to say, you know, I have to keep everything so perfectly clean for this kid. I don't want him to expose to germs. If you do that, the kid is going to be in big trouble because germs are going to find him. And when they do, they're going to have a field day with him. So I talked to a pediatrician about this, and he said that the medical consensus about how to raise a child is to make sure that the child eats a pound of dirt. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, not in one sitting and not icky dirt, but let him be exposed to a variety of sources that aren't going to be perfectly clean. Like the dog. A dog's a good thing to have. Dogs are germ carriers, but by being exposed to them early in life, your child will develop a healthy immune system. Same thing with nut allergies. They used to say, don't give your kid any nuts, any tree nuts, for fear that he'll be allergic to them. And it turned out that by following that advice, people were having kids who simply who were allergic simply because they hadn't been exposed to them. And of course, if you discover late in life that you have a nut allergy, it might be fatal for you. Now, that's your biological immune system. Besides having one of those, you have what I call your psychological immune system. And its job is not to protect you from germs, but to protect you from negative emotions triggered by life setbacks. So imagine you had parents who raised their kid to never experience setbacks. They just set everything up so that the child never got frustrated, never was upset, never was criticized, never was insulted. The child's going to be in deep trouble on reaching adulthood, because he's going to go out into a world where he's going to experience all of those things. But he's going to be hypersensitive to the sorts of things he encounters. It'll be easy to make him angry, easy to make him frustrated. On the smallest setbacks, he'll burst into tears. And that means that if parents want to raise a kid with a healthy psychological immune system, what they need to do is raise him so he's capable of hearing bad news, capable of hearing criticism, capable of encountering setbacks. And the Stoics were big believers in a strong psychological immune system. And so they said, besides one of the things you should do in your Stoic training is you should strengthen your psychological experience, your psychological immune system. You should let bad things happen to you. You should practice that. And then when bad things do happen to you psychologically, if somebody insults you or slights you, you won't get angry, you won't get upset. You will have expanded your comfort zone, your psychological comfort zone, and that'll make it a lot easier for you to function. And I'm going to end this with a quick comment about hate speech, because I think that if we could bring the ancient Stoics forward in time, if we could transport them forward, we would find that they are absolutely amazed and appalled by what is currently going on. And that is, we have people who are the targets of hate speech, who are not taking it at all well. Don't get me wrong, I would love to live in a world without any hate speech, but I don't know if that's possible. But what we're doing is protecting people, doing things to protect people from hearing such speech, from being exposed to hatred. And I know it's well intended, but it can have an unfortunate side effect. And that is that if you put a person into a zone where they're just not exposed to that kind of behavior at all, then if they do experiencing it, it's going to have a profound impact on them. So if they encounter a racist or a sexist who makes some kind of remark, it's going to really strike them to the core. And it's also going to be exactly what the idiot who's responsible for the remark wants to have happen. They say that because they want to ruin your day. And if you let them ruin your day, then that's too bad. You have yourself to blame. So the Stoics, if we could transport them forward, would have said, we need to do what we can to make people tougher, and to make people know that the best way to respond to an insult is to shrug it off. That the people who are responsible for these insults are, in many cases, the human equivalent of a barking dog. And if you let a barking dog ruin your day, you have only yourself to blame. And one thing you really don't want to do is play the role of victim. And think of Martin Luther King. Instead of responding to the extreme racism of his time, instead of responding with action and nonviolent action, suppose he had played the role of victim. Suppose he had said, woe is me, this is so unfair. But he didn't do that. So we're presently in the midst of a great social experiment involving hate speech. And the world has decided the way to handle that is to try to restrict it and to try to protect people from it. The Stoics would say there's a second better way, and that is for people to toughen up, for people to strengthen their psychological immune system, and for people to learn how to deal with insults, to learn how to deal with this kind of speech. And Stoicism offers a way to do that. Now, I'd like to leave some time for questions. So if there are any, I think we'll take those at this point.
Hi.
Hello.
So in terms of questions, the first question is, how do we balance being too careful, but also making sure we expose ourselves or our children to setbacks?
Yeah, it's a fine line between that, and it's how much do you do? You do just the right amount, and it's sensitive experimentation. You see what a person is capable of doing, and you're always pushing the edge, but in a very careful kind of way. A coach will do that with an athlete. You want to encourage. You want to do all you can to build them up, and at the same time, you don't want to push too hard, because then you're going to get somebody who will simply say, well, I'm not going to do this anymore.
Thank you. Why do you believe the ideals of Stoicism are not more widely discussed in our society, as opposed to frames of thought or other frames of thought?
Stoicism had fallen into the dark ages during the 20th century. And when I wrote Guide to the Good Life, I did a count online on Amazon. You can look up the number of books about Stoicism that were published. And back in 2008, when Guide to the Good Life came out, there were a bunch of books written by the ancient Stoics themselves, and there were only a handful of books written about the Stoics, and most of those were intended for academic consumption, and only a few that were intended for a broad audience. So the world simply was in the dark about Stoicism. Not only didn't know what it was, but had the wrong idea what it was. They thought you're supposed to just glumly hold in your emotions, and the Stoics weren't about that at all. But right now you're living in the renaissance of the Stoic movement. It used to be strange to be a Stoic, and now it's kind of cool. And I never thought that day would come. So the other thing is, it's easy to give Stoicism a test drive. You can try out some of its techniques, see whether they work for you or not. Also, among the ancient philosophers, the Stoics are the most readable, I think, in the sense that you can pick up their stuff and very quickly catch on to what they're talking about.
So when rectifying the human predicament, Stoicism and wanting what we have seems to root a lot from mindset changes. What advice do you have in shifting present mindsets to a more Stoic mindset?
In the Stoic Challenge, in the book, The Stoic Challenge, I describe the process of framing, which I didn't have time to talk about today. So you can't necessarily control what happens to you, but you can put whatever frame you want around it. You have a wide choice of frames, and the choice of frames, same is true of a painting. The frame can make the painting beautiful, or it can make the painting ugly. And that's the same with the things that happen to you in life. I describe several frames. One is as the comedic frame. One thing is, when something bad happens to you, you can make a joke about it. It's remarkably effective. So instead of getting angry, you're laughing at what happened. Another frame you can put is the one I described, and that is the Stoic test frame. You can say, it's a test by the Stoic gods. And I'm going to rise. I'm going to show them what kind of person I am. I'm going to rise to this challenge. It's a curious thing. But if you do that, you actually find yourself looking forward to setbacks just so you can show what you're made of.
So how can we use awareness of our reptilian, rational, and emotional parts of our brain and the evolutionary influences on our brain to improve how we currently understand ourselves and our overall lives?
First of all, realize that you're going to spend your life with thoughts popping into your mind, and even worse, desires popping into your mind. And you should become a highly suspicious individual. You should be skeptical. When you find someone there, then you sort of say, oh, that tells me something about my subconscious. Yeah, it's like your dreams. That tells you that something weird's going on there. But you shouldn't just say, it's in my mind, so it must be what I want, because it just doesn't work that way. Like I said, I encourage the audience today to try the meditation I described, and just to look at their minds and how their minds operate. See, we're kind of trapped in the machine, and we never step back and look at what's going on. But when you do, it's a real eye-opener, and you realize, I'm not in control of my own mind, but it's my mind, but I can't control it. And then you can take steps to gain greater control. And so I mentioned two. You can become a Zen Buddhist, you can become a Stoic, and there are other options as well in trying to gain greater control over your mind.
So this question, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, but from Fatima, she says, do you believe that this wiring is coded in our genes due to our ancestors' experience in the early savannah?
Yes. In an answer, yes. Now, again, it isn't wiring. It's much more complicated than that. It's partly our genes, but of course, it's also the environment in which we're raised interacts with those genes. So you have a much more complicated story. I was giving the simple as can be version of events in the talk today. But, if you don't explain it by evolution, then it becomes unexplainable. Why do sweet things taste good? Well, they just do. No, there's a reason, because our ancestors who thought sweet things tasted good got more calories, ended up consuming more calories. And back then, calories were a matter of life and death.
Thank you for that answer. Oh my gosh. So do you think that certain kinds of love have different benefits, such as platonic love, romantic love, familial love, etc.?
I'm a big fan of love. I'm a big fan of emotions. I regard myself as an emotional being, but it's all a question of how you do it, what you do with it. Any of these things can lead you into deep trouble. Being too rational can lead you into deep trouble if it means you exclude these emotions. Part of the human experience is to feel emotions deeply. And I don't know if life would be worthwhile if you didn't do that. So the point here isn't to sort of outwit the emotions. And in fact, in the Stoic challenge, I describe how the Stoics not only found ways to avoid negative emotions, but found ways to make negative emotions work on their behalf. So when you are presented with one of these Stoic tests, when you experience a setback, then the response is, I'm going to show them, right? So it's that whole pride and everything else, which are emotions. And instead of getting angry, you're developing these emotions that are going to help you overcome the setback. And you're going to have a feeling of pride afterwards. So emotions are great. Positive emotions are great. Negative emotions, try to minimize them because they're just no fun. That's why we label them as negative.
Hey, for the final question, now does have some relation to the answer that you just gave, but how do you practice Stoicism without becoming indifferent to different, like other things that matter?
Stoicism, I have a life that looks very much like any other life, except that these Stoic, and I have 5 major ones that I describe in Guide to the Good Life. These are Stoic strategies. These are practices. These are things you can do. The world won't know you're doing them unless you announce it to the world, but like negative visualization. can be done at any time. I mean, another one is what Marcus Aurelius called the bedtime meditation, where before you fall asleep, what you're going to do is you're going to review your day, and you're going to think about the things you did, and you're going to ask yourself, what motivated me to behave in such a way? And as a result, you're going to realize, oh, the reason I said that snarky thing to my colleague is I was experiencing envy at that point. I'll put that on my list of things to work on. I need to overcome that particular negative emotion. And, the other strategies, one is, I call it the last time meditation. There will be a last time for everything you do in your life. But, if you keep that in mind, it sounds like that would be really depressing, but it can actually give meaning to the things you do. So you go out and mow the lawn, which I'm supposed to do tomorrow. And you can either go and say that what drudgery this is, but, if you go out and think, there will be a last time. This could be that last time. This could be a time that I will look back on the future. In the future, I will look back on as the good old days. Remember when I could still mow a lawn? Boy, those were the good old days. And they can invest meaning into what would otherwise be activities that you take utterly for granted.
Okay, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. You're very welcome.
I really enjoyed this talk. I know a lot of us also enjoyed listening about Stoicism. And yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time to come out and talk to us.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do it. It was just sort of, for me, an interesting audience because there are a whole bunch of different ways. I could take the science route, I could take the philosophy route, and then I tried to do some kind of hybrid mix of those.
Yeah, we definitely loved it and we're super interested. But yeah, thank you for coming.